Thank you very much for the invitation, and allow me to stand on an existing protocol. We in CODESRIA have been privileged to publish previously 7 titles from Professor Paul Tiyambe Zeleza. 7. One of the titles won the Noma Award for publishing in Africa in 1994. And it's the title, A Modern Economic History of Africa. Professor Zeleza decided to say that that title was volume 1, focusing on the 19th century. We're still waiting for volume 2. And I can only say this because I know Professor Zeleza well, and I know that in his interaction with Professor Bethuel Alan Ogot, the editor of the 8-volume UNESCO General History of Africa, he also raised the same question to Professor Bethuel Alan Ogot. So as we wait for volume 2 of A Modern Economic History of Africa, I'm happy that we are able to launch the 8th study written by Professor Paul Tiyambe Zeleza and published by CODESRIA. The book has been in production for roughly 6 months, and we only were able to release both the soft and hard copies of the book 2 weeks ago. It is our privilege and our honor not just to publish Professor Zeleza, but to also be able to launch this book in a number of places, the first of which is at the Africa Institute here in Sharjah. We will also be doing a second launch of the book in Dakar next week, and we will be doing a third launch, I believe, in Washington, D.C. at Howard University later on in the year. The book, Re-envisioning the African and American Academy, attempts an interrogation of the academy in Africa and in the US against the background of the post-COVID world. It's a book that has rich data and detail for Africa and useful comparative case studies from the American Academy. It is the 4th book that Zeleza has written that speaks to the agenda that unites all of us, including us in CODESRIA, but also in Sharjah at the Africa Institute. It's a book that comes highly recommended by a group of former and current administrators of universities, not just in Africa, but also across the world. Professor Zeleza is not just an author with CODESRIA. He is a child of CODESRIA in every sense of the word. So as I listen to him talk about the younger scholars, I can only imagine what CODESRIA has done to him for him to get to this point. And I'm only saying this because my personal journey and that of Professor Zeleza has intersected in a few interesting ways. He taught at Kenyatta University in Nairobi, Kenya, and left only 2 years before I became an undergraduate student in that same university, in that same department. He then left and was back again in Nairobi as the Vice Chancellor of United States International University. But there is one thing that has been common to our intellectual journeys, and that one thing is CODESRIA. Because a modern economic history of Africa, when it started as a course being taught in the Department of History at Kenyatta University. And in the preface of the book that we want to launch, Re-envisioning the African and American Academy, Professor Zeleza begins to give his own story about the journey he has undertaken up to where he is at the moment. On behalf of CODESRIA and on behalf of colleagues that have been involved in the CODESRIA journey, I want to thank Professor Zeleza, but I also want to thank all those who have been supportive of his work, and want to take this opportunity to first invite Professor Zeleza to just speak briefly to the book, and then we will do a launch, and I will provide some additional instructions on how we are going to finalize with the launch of the book. Professor Zeleza.
Thank you, Godwin. As I said briefly during my remarks, without CODESRIA, I would not be where I am today. I would not be who I am today. This book, in many ways, is a distillation of debates in CODESRIA circles about higher education on the continent. And as you know, many years ago, CODESRIA established the African Journal of Higher Education to continue as a space to continue debates about the state of higher education on the continent. The book was inspired by an effort to understand not only my engagements with universities in the United States and on the continent, but it came immediately after I'd finished my term as Vice Chancellor in Nairobi and processing the challenges that university leaders always face that were compounded by the experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic, when leadership of institutions, organizations, and certainly, of course, countries was put under enormous strain to continue providing education and for other sectors, of course, providing whatever those sectors provided. So when I left Nairobi, towards the end of 2021, I got a fellowship for 2022-23 at Harvard at the Hutchins Center for African American Research, which is headed by Henry Louis Gates. There were, I think that year, about 20 of us who were fellows. It was an enormously rich experience. That's, so I spent that fellowship, which is a one-year fellowship, working on this book. I was also doing my normal job on top of that. The book is an attempt to try to understand what has happened to higher education in the last 2.5 decades. Going back to the turn of the 1980s with a neoliberal turn, which transformed not only economies, but higher education institutions. And I was interested in trying to understand what was happening on the continent and what was happening in the United States, because I've been involved in both systems. The book opens with what I call, chapter 1, the struggle for African universities and knowledges. So it looks at this massive growth, explosion of institutions since the 2000s across the continent, and the debates about knowledge production and so on, some of the things that I mentioned in the presentation. And the book ends, chapter 8, focusing exclusively on the United States. The debates, the chapter is titled America's Troubles with Affirmative Action, in which the issue of diversity, inclusion, or diversity, equity, and inclusion has been a hot political potato for decades. It came to a head last year when the Supreme Court abolished affirmative action in universities. I trace the struggle over affirmative action from the 1930s. Because as a historian, I'm always fascinated by when people think something just started today. This started a long time ago. And the different stages that eventually led to 2023. The chapters in between are really a comparative analysis of what's going on the continent and what's going on in the United States, with gestures almost in every chapter to what's going on in the world of higher education as a whole. So what's going on in Europe, what's going on in Asia, what's going on in Latin America. The second chapter is higher education and development, which looks at the ways in which higher education has been seen as a tool of development. The ways in which higher education has been seen as an important part of building human capital, of building science, technology, and innovation capacities, and what is going on now with the digital revolution, including AI. How are those things being integrated into the core functions of universities in terms of teaching and learning, research and scholarship, operations, and in the university's external engagements. The third chapter, and I'm sure the chancellor as well as the president of the university this university would appreciate, is the challenges of managing and financing universities. What are the challenges of leading African universities? Challenges of leading American universities? What are the global trends in funding for higher education? So I have a long section looking at global trends in Asia, Europe, Africa, Latin America, and so on, giving data, what has happened over the last 20, 25 years, 30 years, in terms of financing higher education, and management structures, governance structures, and so on. And then I look at, for each chapter, I tend to pick a few countries for case studies. So on the funding models in select countries, I look at 10 African countries. How has their funding model of higher education progressed over the last 30, 40 years? Then the fourth chapter is navigating the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, what happened globally? How did universities around the world? I used to belong to the International Association of Universities on their board, and we commissioned studies on how universities in Asia, Europe, Africa, Latin America, you name it, how they were dealing with COVID, how prepared, and how did they make the transitions and so on. And then also looking at how did American universities deal with COVID, and what was the impact on the institutional cultures, the learning systems, and so on. And what are the implications of this pivotal moment for higher education? I argue that university leaders are preoccupied with three trajectories. One is what I call the return to the pre-COVID situation in which they're very anxious to go back. Others are interested in grafting reforms based on the experiences of the COVID pandemic. And others are interested in transformation, much deeper changes. So there is the restoration agenda, the reform agenda, and the transformation agenda. And of course, these occur sometimes even in the same institution. And we are in a very fascinating period in the way students learn, in the way people teach, in the way research is being done, precisely because of COVID. Of course, COVID accelerated trends that were going on before. It was a real-time experiment, which higher education, which is known to be very slow, quickly had to pivot. The fifth chapter looks at what it's titled The Futures of Education. And here I'm trying to, based on contemporary trends in Africa, in the United States, and around the world, where is higher education headed for the next 20, 30, 40 years? And here I looked at a lot of literature produced by global agencies and regional agencies, UNESCO, the OECD, EU, AU, AAU, you name it, in the United States, and so on and so forth. And how we need to seriously rethink the role of education, specifically higher education, in the kind of world that we all know is emerging, faster in certain areas than others. The sixth chapter is on the imperatives of lifelong learning. One of the key transformations that is taking place, for all sorts of reasons that are going to the book, is that learning is no longer sort of tied to a particular stage in your life. Learning has to be for life because of the rapid changes of society and the economy and so on. So I look at lifelong learning debates around the world from the 19th century, in Europe, America, and so on, and in Africa. And some of the forces that are leading to these transformations, including technological disruptions, the changing nature of work, demographic shifts, external interventions and impact, and the entry of new educational providers. Higher education is no longer fully in control of education at the tertiary level. There are a lot more actors now than ever before. And the degree as a signal to the market of certain qualifications is eroding. What are the implications of those dynamics? And then I look at how American universities are trying to undertake lifelong learning, African universities, and so on. The seventh chapter is looking specifically at an area that many of us in this room are very interested in. And the title is Repositioning the Humanities and Social Sciences. Almost everywhere, the humanities and social sciences are being devalued. And all sorts of attacks are made against these fields. So I look at the global landscape of the social sciences and humanities. What's going on in Asia, in Europe, in the Americas, in the humanities and social sciences. Then look very specifically at the humanities crisis discourse in the United States. If you look at much of the discussion about the humanities in the US, everybody tells you it's in crisis. As a historian, I was also interested in the origins of that discourse. It goes back to the 1930s. But it has shifted in terms of what are the factors and, of course, the effects and the manifestations of that crisis. The emergence of the so-called digital humanities. And then I look at what's going on with regards to the social sciences and humanities in Africa. And I was a dean of a College of Liberal Arts in California, and I was used to making defenses of the humanities. And I provide, what I think should be compelling defenses for the humanities. In fact, I believe they're more necessary now than ever before, for all sorts of reasons that I go into. And then I also look at the importance of the interdisciplinary imperative in terms of us trying to analyze and understand society. I regard this volume as a follow-up to a book I published in 2016, which was on the transformation of global higher education, also written during another fellowship at Harvard, in which I looked at the development of higher education on every continent between 1945 and 2015. And I was very pleased when CODESRIA agreed to publish the book. CODESRIA undergoes a very rigorous process of review, and I want to thank CODESRIA for publishing the book, but also taking the book through this very rigorous process. One of the readers did an absolutely fantastic critique, which sent me back to the drawing board. So I want to thank the anonymous editors, reviewers of the book. And CODESRIA also has fantastic copy editors. The one I've worked with now twice. Another book was published 2021. Sandy Shepherd, I want to mention her. Please thank her on my behalf for absolutely brilliant editing. And I want to thank the Hutchins Center at Harvard, for giving me the opportunity to, use that fellowship. It was a W.B. Du Bois Fellowship to work on the book, and my, network of friends and colleagues in different parts of the world, especially on the continent, who I would send chapters, and they would give me really, really wonderful, wonderful critiques. I always say the person I always thank first and foremost is my wife, who is the first person to read everything I write, just like I'm the first person to read everything she writes. And we are each other's best critics. We are very unsparing in our critical eye to each other's work. And without her critical eye, this book would not be what it is. So thank you, CODESRIA. Thank you to all the people involved in the production of this book. And thank you to the Africa Institute, the Global Studies University, for the opportunity to do the first launch of this book on your campus. And of course, I'm very grateful to be able to do this at a conference discussing the work of my great mentor, Thandeka Nkandawire. I think he would approve of what I'm trying to say, but he would also criticize many aspects of the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Zeleza. I agree, I don't have any additional instructions on this, but it would be a good idea to leave a launch picture with the president and the chancellor of the university at the very least. I'm also informed that the Africa Institute has secured a number of copies of the book, and they are available on sale in the bookshop. But there are a few copies that we have asked Professor Zeleza to sign. So we'll do that, and then we can move on from there. Please take it away.
You're very right, Dr. Murunga, and congratulations, Professor Zeleza. So, MC, can I, okay, thank you. Prof. Zeleza, if you can move to the table there, and I think sign a couple of copies. Dr. Murunga, I think you'll be, perhaps we take a picture first. Yes. Hura Kasimi, Prof. M. Salah, please, if you may take the stage.